So thank you so much for being here, Mark, and everybody else who's here. I'm delighted that everybody's going to hear your about your book, and then we're going to have a discussion about a little more than about the metronome. So, Mark, let's.
All right. So thank you all for being here. Debbie had attended my talk, the book launch, a couple months ago in Raleigh, and then asked if I would do a follow-up session. Um, this will be very impromptu. I've got some images that I'll show you from the book. Um, it was a project that I began shortly after the Beethoven project. At one point, I think I was in my study and turned to my metronome, which, like all of you, is very much a love-hate relationship, and realized I knew nothing about how it had developed. And I suspected, given its relationship with time, that it had a very rich history, which it proved to be the case. So I jumped into that project and pitched it to my publisher, and they were very much on board. There had not been a book about the history of musical timekeeping ever written. There were aspects of it and articles of different components of it, but nothing had ever been brought into one volume. So it was a very interesting project. The book came out in September, I believe, September, October. It was a labor of love, and the project is now done, and I'm on to other things. But I'm very happy to tell you a little bit about kind of how the book's put together. And when I'm done, I guess we'll have a brief question and answer service, or question and answer session. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hang on one second. I gotta go back to that. You all can't see that, can you? Oh,
Not yet.
hang on one second. There we go. Okay. This is the man we have to thank or curse for the metronome, Johann Nepomuk Melzel. He was born in Regensburg, Germany. He was a pianist by training and an engineer. And he moved relatively early on to Vienna, where he became kind of the chief engineer of the Habsburgs. So he had a workshop, apparently, in the Schönbrunn Palace. And his early notoriety actually came with a number of devices that he was involved with. So I'm going to talk very briefly about Melzel first, and then I'm going to switch back to kind of give you an idea of kind of the scope of the book and kind of our earlier vestiges of musical timekeeping and how they functioned, and then we'll catch back up with Melzel then on the other side. But his early claim to fame was really kind of an engineer of a number of devices. He had created, for example, a mechanical trumpeter. These what they called automatons at the time, where they were. I remember as a kid, we had a bank. Some of you probably might remember these, and it had a guy on a pedestal, and you put a penny in his hand, and I think somehow it moved and it dropped the penny into a slot, right? So they had very sophisticated kind of machinery back in the 19th century, and Melzel was right at the forefront of kind of this entertainment. And he would barnstorm across Europe and actually came to America also with a number of these devices. He had a mechanical trumpeter. I think there was a ballerina. And the thing that really made him famous was a device called the Turk. And this is an image of it. This isn't actually Melzel's, but it's a recreation of an image of a recreation of what existed. And I think, and that's close. It's the same thing basically. But he bought the device from the inventor, or from the inventor's family. The inventor had died and it kind of lay dormant. And he bought it and he made a number of improvements. And basically the idea is that um, they would put somebody inside this box, and I've never seen it functioning, but they would close it, and the fellow underneath could see a reverse of the chess image, and he would move this hand, and so it would opponents would play the Turk in chess games, and but nobody could figure out how it worked, and it was a little bit like, you know, magicians today when they open the box, or like in the Nutcracker, and they swing it around. There's got mirrors, but you can't tell if there's anybody actually inside it. So nobody actually ever saw um, the worker underneath the machinery here working it, and he apparently played. I think Napoleon, and he came to the United States, and he barnstormed here, and he met Barnum, and Edgar Allan Poe was fascinated with this machine, and nobody ever figured out how it worked. He ended up traveling to Cuba, and on the way back, he died. He died at sea, and he was buried at sea. But before that, he had a very rich history and it kind of culminated with the metronome, of course, and with Beethoven, whom he knew personally, for better or for worse, and I'll hopefully have time to get into kind of their relationship. Um, so um, his Another one of his claims to fame was something called a panharmonicon, which was kind of a one-man band. It was kind of air-driven. It had cymbals and horns and all kinds of machinery. Um, and this was an instrument actually that he had built and was also traveling across Europe. And he engaged Beethoven to write a piece for it. That's Wellington's Victory, which was originally written for this instrument, and then Beethoven and Melzel had a big falling out over who actually owned the rights to it. And they went their separate ways for quite a long time. And then after years, Melzel came back when he was trying to pitch the metronome and realized that Beethoven would be somebody very good to get into his camp, which ultimately happened. So that's kind of a little bit about Melzel pre-metronome. So I want to jump now back several centuries to the 15th century. So some of our earliest, okay, so let me back for 1 second. When I started this project, the idea originally was going to be to write a book about Melzel. But as I got kind of more and more into it, I realized that it would be a far more interesting book to talk about musical timekeeping as history, and to go back to kind of the earliest that we know it existed. Obviously, it existed much earlier than we have actual tangible evidence of that. But one of the first kind of hard pieces of evidence of musical timekeeping stems from Italy, from Florence. This was an organ loft or a choir loft that was created by an artisan at the time of in the 15th century. So he was contemporary of Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, and Michelangelo actually, and he actually created this choir loft for the Duomo in Florence. It's not there anymore. It was taken out by one of the Medicis, and it now exists in the Florence Duomo Museum right across the street. If you've been to Florence before, where the Ghiberti doors are now kept. So he created this marble image, which literally was overshadowed by Brunelleschi's dome, and it was probably almost unnoticed. It sat above an entrance to one of the basic rooms there. Donatello was subsequently charged to create another choir loft in the adjacent room, and both of those are now in this Duomo Museum. But on opposite sides of this loft are two images that have early examples of musical timekeeping. So you can see in this side here, I'm going to show you a detail of that. And there are many more images in the book, but I've just chosen some that I think are kind of representative. So this is called Boys Singing from a Scroll or something of that nature. And what's important from our standpoint is this hand, this finger, and this hand here with this finger raised also. And so these are early images of musical timekeeping that looks very kind of casual, just hands on shoulders. But as we will see, this was actually how musical pulse was transmitted from one performer to the next, and actually how it was also musical pulse was taught. This was pre-pendulum, so before Galileo had created the pendulum, and subsequent scientists and musicians had realized how to kind of usurp the pendulum for musical purposes, which would happen a couple centuries later. So we have some early images, which I'll show you, which indicate how that speak about the actual use of hands on shoulders, also feet tapping, and in fact, in the other image, which I don't have a slide here, Della Robbia, the artist who crafted this, you could see actually a foot raised by one of the singers. But you can see this arm from this singer right here. This is his hand, and his middle finger is raised. That's important because that was apparently how pulse was often transmuted. So they used the middle finger, and here you can see it again, the middle finger, and here the whole hand is being kind of patted on his shoulder. So they are keeping musical time. And in fact, about a century later, a music historian by the name of Gafurius, and he's one of the early important music historians. He wrote a lot about kind of music at the time. If you talk to early music historians, they're all very familiar with this guy's work. It's possible this is actually Gafurius here in the front. We don't really know, but I'm going to zoom in. You can see. Wait a second. If you look closely, it's not. Let me zoom in any closer. But you can see that his hand is on his shoulder. His hand is on his shoulder. And so this is exactly the same kind of musical communication that we see in the Della Robbia choir loft. And Gafurius talks about that in his book, that the teacher, and there's another actually woodcut of Gafurius where the teacher is standing behind a student with his hand on it, and that student is standing behind the next smaller student with his hand on his shoulder. And this is how musical timekeeping was conveyed and taught from one to the next. I have also another image from about the same time as Gafurius, and it's from Italian Florigerio, a painting called The Music Lesson, which is one of several paintings I talk about in the book. Again, early visual images about musical timekeeping. And this is an interesting painting from a number of respects, but one is for our purposes, again, the fingers, finger raised, and this is actually, if you look here, this is actually the woman's finger up in front. And this fellow here who has his arm seductively around the woman has his hand theoretically on her shoulder to convey time, finger up. Whether that's really his modus operandus, I don't really know. But it's an interesting painting also because historians seem to think that this figure and this is a younger version of this figure here. This is him as an older man. Both of them have rings on their first fingers up. And in fact, this woman back here is possibly an older version of the female up front, who's kind of, in this case, looking on and seeing what's actually transpiring in front of her. Who knows what she's thinking? But this woman she's in the thick of it, ostensibly to get a music lesson, but it could be another lesson entirely when this scene is over. But for our purposes, hands very much involved in the act of musical timekeeping. So, from basically these early images then in the book, I then will jump to Galileo, who is the first one to have observed the act of a pendulum. In the story that Galileo told, he apparently was in a church, in his home church. He was already a medical student, but he was sitting in the church, and um, they had lowered one of the candelabras to either to light it or to refill it with candles. And what was pulled, and the cord was pulled, the thing went back up into the ceiling of the cathedral. And as it swung back and forth, Galileo was sitting there watching it and noted that the slower it swung, the speed of the actual swing remained the same. And so he was very much fascinated by this concept. It existed, obviously, a long time up to that point, but he's the first one that apparently paid attention to it. Now, every time I'm taking, my grandchild to the park and put her in a swing, I'm noticing the same thing. And then subsequent scientists and some were musicians, not necessarily, but they eventually took the idea of this pendulum and plugged it into devices that could then be used for music. So, for example, one of the earliest and most sophisticated is a device by a Frenchman named Louis, his chronomètre. So we're now around middle of the 17th century, so 1600s. This isn't the only device that served this capacity, but his is one of the most sophisticated. And basically what he's got is a pendulum here. It's attached to a cord. And when you determined what the pulse was of the music you wanted to play, you adjusted the length of this cord so that the pendulum then swung at that speed. And then you noted the number that was on the side of the instrument. This was made of wood, basically. And then you could theoretically convey that number to somebody, on the other side of Paris or the other side of Europe or the other side of the world, that happened to be playing the same piece of music that you wrote, so that they would be able to play it in the same tempo. Now, there were a number of issues, as you can imagine, with the system, starting with the fact that whoever you're transmitting this information to would have had to have also Louis' chronomètre and not some other device with the same numerical system. That was one big problem. And ultimately, this system per se did not catch on. He did not, make a mint with it, as Melzel would make with his metronome, but it kind of set the standard. The other problem, of course, was that length was not standardized, even within, let's say, Paris. So there was something called the French inch, there was the King's inch, and there was a slightly different measuring system, whether you were in the city or out in the provinces somewhere, much less in England. So depending on what your measurement system was, it wouldn't sync up exactly with what Louis had in mind. What is curious in this time is that a number of musicians, French musicians, who were kind of absorbed with the idea of trying to create musical timekeeping and how to replicate the same time value in one piece to the next piece, were not the musicians, not composers, but musicians who were very much involved with the French court. And it was largely Lully's music that they wanted to try to systematize. There was no way to determine from one performance to the next or one generation, to the next, what the correct tempo should be. So these were systems that were largely created in order to that Lully's, at least originally, that Lully's music could be passed on from generation to generation and recreated at the same tempo that it existed at the time. So they were already aware that this was something that was going to be reproduced at some point down the road. And we think about composers now trying to give us as much information in their music so that it would be performed as precisely as possible, whether it's metronome markings or tempo indications, explanations, things like that. And so this is really kind of the origins of all of that information. Um, so jumping ahead, sorry, I'll give you one more. This is actually a system that was created by Thomas Jefferson. Um, there were many different types of systems. One that Jefferson, who was a great inventor, as you all know, and if you've been to Monticello, you've seen his clock inside under the portico of Monticello. That's two chords which are strung from a cannonball. There are cannonballs on either side. And they descend into the basement and they indicate on the walls also what day it was. So he was very interested in all kinds of gadgets to make life interesting and easier in cases. And when he was in France serving for our country, he was actually introduced to some early chronometers, musical chronometers. He wrote home about a couple that he had seen, and I talk about them in the book. There was a very interesting kind of competition that was going on at the time that Jefferson was there. But then he created his own system, basically, and the idea is that he would have insert dowels, little little posts in the wall at various intervals, and he talks about this, kind of how it should be done, and that you could then swing this chord and create these various tempos. It was extremely limited, of course, but it was, Jefferson's takeaway was, after having seen some pretty sophisticated devices, you can do something cheaply at home, and this was kind of his kind of quick fix. And I talk about both Europeans and some Americans also who were very much involved, kind of caught up with the whole idea of musical timekeeping and how to create it. There were kind of two basic ideas that were going on simultaneously. One was the ability to replicate a tempo of a piece of music, whether you were the composer or you are the performer. So that was one. And the other was to use the pendulum as a means of bettering your own time or teaching timekeeping to the student. So there are a lot of discussions about how it should best be used. There are discussions which seem crazy today, but it was a thing that whether it should, once this pendulum was set in motion, should it continue through the duration of the piece, and should the piece be kind of determined by the speed of the metronome or the speed of the chronometer, as they called it at the time, or was it just a means of getting a sense of the tempo at the beginning and then you don't pay attention to it anymore? So these were all very lively discussions that were going on for several centuries, largely in Europe, and they were kind of set the background for the metronome, which then could be used for any or all of these. Jumping way ahead, so this is this was an early Melzel. Well, it was probably not called the metronome yet because he had not invented the metronome, but it was a chronometer. You can see some semblance of the gauging on the device. Very crude. It looks a little bit like Louis' the woodcut that I showed you. And this is probably a device very similar to what Melzel had in mind when he first showed Beethoven the early timekeeper. And Beethoven was not particularly caught up in this. In fact, one of Beethoven's friends was also monkeying around with some of these ideas, which Beethoven seemed much more interested in. And then Beethoven and Melzel had a falling out over the whole panharmonicon business. And Beethoven and Melzel had at one point planned to go to London together. Beethoven had written most of, with Melzel's help, this Wellington's Victory. It was going to be kind of, it played God Save the Queen, and it had all these various tunes. They were going to wow the Brits with it, and then they had their big falling out. But Melzel went on ahead to London. He was probably en route with some of his other machinery, the Turk perhaps, and certainly the trumpeter, which was one of his kind of showstoppers. And he was in Amsterdam, and he was probably on the way to London to patent this device. There was also some semblance, I can't remember right now, but he was already becoming aware that it needed to be, in order to be a game changer, it had to um, um, be able to determine actually real time. So not a length like Louis was talking about in inches, but actually in times, portions of a minute. Um, they were just now, clockwork was just now beginning to determine seconds on a clock. Um, there were earlier instances of people writing about teaching time by the town clock. So in the, for instance, in the 15th and 16th centuries, um, clocks in the middle of town often didn't have numbers. Certainly didn't have fractions of numbers because people were not educated generally. They would not have been able to read it. But the clocks tolled on the hour, so people understood the workday or the prayer times. And so some of the early authors of talking about musical time would suggest that you'd go and listen to the clock in the square or whatever, and you'd learn to kind of beat time and keep time to that. Once the grandfather clock became more and more common in the home, seconds became possible, and so you could have portions of minutes beginning to invade the idea of musical timekeeping. And so Melzel was already kind of aware of that, but it was still operating as a pendulum. So it was not particularly, I mean, it was very reliable, but part of the problem is to see exactly where it passed a certain point, right? You're eyeing it, and obviously you're taking your eyes away from the music at the time, and you're seeing this chord go back and forth, but when is it exactly at center? So there were all kinds of issues involved. Some early inventors put mirrors on so they could kind of see better the actual point of the center, but lots of issues were in play all the way through the 1700s. In about 1815, Melzel's on his way to London, probably to patent this idea. And in Amsterdam, he's at a big fair and he's showing his various devices. He also had a huge diorama of the fire, the burning of Russia, which must have been, according to descriptions of the thing, bells and sirens and smoke, and apparently was just a huge spectacle. So he was there showing his wares, and he encounters a man named Nicholas Winkel, Winkel, who was a Dutch inventor and a clockmaker. And he had moved to Amsterdam and had pitched this prototype, and this is the actual picture of the actual prototype, which is in a Dutch museum, of a early metronome to the Scientific Society of Amsterdam and of the Netherlands. He had sent them the prototype, boxed up with a letter, and right at this time, probably just before that happened, actually, Melzel shows up in Amsterdam. We don't actually know how the two of them came to meet one another, but he showed Melzel this device. And the lights must have gone off in Melzel's head because he had all these ideas about musical timekeeping and his pendulum and how could he get to the next level. And then he sees this device with a anchored in in this case it's anchored in the middle here, a sliding weight here, and it basically kind of flipped the pendulum, literally kind of flipped the pendulum on its head. So instead of swinging from the top and showing the time at the bottom, this did just the opposite. And Melzel saw this device and he's like, his head must have started to explode because it was like a miraculous moment of intuition that he had not been able to make that jump, and he sees it here. We don't know how Winkel actually crossed into this territory. He was not a musician at all, but he had this idea. He'd been reading some other manuals, and he fastens this weight in the middle, which created the ability to condense what had been literally 4 feet. That image I showed you of Louis A, this thing right here, in order to swing at 1 second's worth of time, you needed a pendulum that hung about roughly 4 feet. I could, if in the book I talk more specifically, but you get the idea how big and cumbersome and unportable something like that would have been. And all of a sudden, great Scott, he sees this thing which was like compressed into, well, bigger than our tactile metronome, but maybe a foot in height. Is able to do all these things and to do it incredibly accurately. And you can also harness it to a bell so you can hear, you don't have to look at the device anymore. He offers to buy this from Winkel. Winkel says no, refuses. I don't know what Winkel had, what his designs were. I mean, I think literally he was going to probably get the backing of the Dutch Scientific Society first, which is kind of the way you get your foot in the door, and then you can take it to the next level. Well, Melzel offered to buy it. Winkel said no. Melzel said, okay, I got to go. And he almost literally jumped in his coach and rode to Paris. En route, was creating diagrams. And when he got to Paris, he patented the idea within a matter of weeks of seeing Winkel's prototype. Pretty crude patent, but it was the first time, and now he calls it the metronome for the first time. From there, he goes to London. He's got now more time on his hands, and he creates a much more sophisticated, draws together a much more sophisticated drawings and descriptions of it, patents it in London, and by that point, he starts to manufacture it. And the next stage is to sell, obviously to sell it across Europe, but also he gives copies of his metronome to a number of composers. Salieri gets one, a number of French composers get one, and he sends one to Beethoven. And that's kind of the beginning of their patching up their falling out from before. This is an early Melzel metronome, one of the first. I use this in the book because I got a number of images from an English collector of metronomes, a fellow by the name of Tony Bingham, who was very, very generous in loaning me a number of images. And he has just a fabulous collection of some of the earliest and just throughout the whole history. And I have replicas of them in my book, of a number of them. I use this one in the book because in my discussion about Beethoven, so we know as musicians that Beethoven was very consumed with musical time and metronomizing his compositions. He didn't do all of them, but we know as musicians we struggle with some pretty radical metronome markings of Beethoven. And I talk in the book about various reasons why these errors probably cropped up, which are errors which are maybe a consequence of his hearing, his consequence of playing through incipits on the piano, and then his nephew Carl, the one who tried to commit suicide, if you know about Beethoven, was doing a lot of the notation of the metronome markings for Beethoven. And whether the metronome was sitting askew on the piano, whether it was not calibrated correctly. In a number of cases, Beethoven writes letters to people to make sure his metronome is calibrated correctly. So there are a number of things in play with Beethoven. And for instance, even in the Ninth Symphony, you can see on the score, and I talk about this in the book, several metronome markings that Beethoven was struggling with. And he would write in his so he was deaf by this point. His nephew is writing down this discussion, and Beethoven's answering out loud, so we don't know what Beethoven's response was, but his nephew's writing, but uncle, this morning you said this was 60 beats per minute, and now you're saying whatever. So we can see him struggling with, and the reason I used this metronome, besides the fact that it's one of the earliest of Melzel, and you can already see the kind of classic triangular shape, and it's in a box with this, with the gauge on the back of the metronome. So much like some of the metronomes you probably grew up with. Obviously, the knob came off and it was put on upside down, and that's how it was published in the book. And I thought it was very telling that this was also another possible reason why Beethoven's metronome markings in places may have been inaccurate. Were they reading the bottom of the scale when it was accidentally turned upside down, or was his cousin, or his nephew or somebody? So this is another kind of potentially disastrous situation that the metronome kind of led to, at least with replicating Beethoven's markings. So let's see, that takes us back up through Melzel. And then from here, my book, once the Melzel metronome is created, it is the kind of the zenith of this search that had gone on for centuries and centuries. And ostensibly, not a lot of changes occurred to it from the time Melzel did his first patents until we went to digital versions that are in your phones, and we had I don't have one anymore, but we probably all had battery operated small Seiko metronomes at one point. So that was basically what took the place of this kind of analog version. But some of us probably still have this, and this was not an unsimilar metronome that's sitting on my shelf behind me, that was kind of the catalyst for this whole book. Then once I get through Melzel, then I talk about kind of the fallout of the metronome, how various composers used or abused or refused the metronome. And I use some composers who are very well known. I talk about a little bit with Brahms and Mendelssohn, and Louis Spohr, who was a very, very early champion, and some less known composers. And I take it really through the kind of the electronic age. And so it was a very fascinating project. So that's kind of the upshot, and kind of how we got to Melzel's metronome in a well, I just saved you about 200 pages of sometimes pretty dense text. Yeah, that's the gist of what I have to say. So I'll open it up for either questions, which I may or may not be able to answer. And I guess we have some of my very esteemed colleagues who can weigh in on how or if they use the metronome in their own teaching.
Okay, would you like to go back to the full screen now?
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Well, that was so interesting, and you did just an amazing job of research to get all of that. Thank you so much. So, who would like to ask a question?
Hey, Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, hey, Lee.
Yeah, hey, fabulous, man. Just out of sight. Really enjoyed that. And every aspect. And I followed all the detail, and your research is terrific, and your presentation. One thing that struck me really interesting is that, and forgive me for being related, but a little unrelated, but not. A number of years ago, excuse me, I was reading a book, and it happened upon the use of the invention of the chronometer for keeping time at sea.
Uh-huh.
And I had no idea that the early metronomes were called the same thing.
Yeah, they had, from my understanding, one blanket term for timekeeper, which was chronometer. And yeah, I mentioned that very briefly in the book,
Interesting.
and several of the contemporaries who were working on similar devices, but some of them were also musicians and were tinkering also with uh, the early musical chronometer and how best to use that. But yeah,
Cool.
um,
Thank you.
there
Thank
were
you.
some amazing minds. That was probably one of the most interesting things about the research was going back and looking at a lot of these early treatises, even well before that, the race for the naval chronometer was how various writers and scientists post Galileo were trying to harness this information. Uh,
Right.
and I talk about a number of them in the book. Yes,
Sure.
super interesting. Yeah.
Very. And just one other little point. Never, ever, ever occurred to me that you talked about the King's Inch or the differences, the things we take for granted now that are standard. Never ever occurred to me that back, excuse me, one of my cats is in the picture. Just never occurred to me. And of course, now that I think about it, it makes sense that things weren't always standardized.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and that units of measure would have been different depending on where you lived.
Yep, very interesting history of all that. And for me, one of the most interesting parts of that, which I don't talk about at all in the book because it wasn't relevant, was when they were trying. One of the reasons they needed to get a standardized um, concept of time was for locomotive schedules across Europe. Uh, that was apparently a huge hurdle. So that, not just within one country, but once, rail travel was taking you from one country to another, that they had the ability to know specifically when a train was going to be there. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Cool.
Thank you. Other questions before we get to our panel? Nancy.
Hey, Mark, yeah, I was really interested what you were talking about with composers putting metronome markings on there that just seem so wacky. I was really interested what you said about that. Like when Larry Todd and I were recording Mendelssohn and the B flat sonata, is it the first movement? I should have gone to get my score, but where there's a tempo marking put in, I think, by was it a contemporary of Mendelssohn's or something?
Yeah, Mendelssohn is one of the figures that I talk about in the book. He tended not to use metronome marking. There are a couple of cases where he did in some choral music. And in his case, some of that was a fallout of somebody else conducting his music and apparently just like had no clue what the tempo was supposed to be. And so when the piece was published, I think there's one of his psalms, he went back to the editor and made sure that it had some metronome markings in there because he just didn't want it to be so manhandled, when he wasn't at the helm. But he was one of these composers where, for Mendelssohn, generally less is more. If you look most at Mendelssohn's tempo indications, it tends to be very basic Italian. It doesn't even, like Berlioz will go into a lot of detail in his Italian to try to get the point across. And Mendelssohn will be allegro or allegro moderato. And he kind of leaves it largely in most cases, to the performer. But in a couple of cases of his choral music, he apparently got his hackles up. And so he put some metronome markings in. But largely for composers like Mendelssohn, and part of the problem with Mendelssohn, big problem, is that he died before a lot of his music was actually published. So it was kind of, some of it was published, but a lot of it was not, and it was handled then by editors after his death. And many of them went ahead and made decisions about tempos. So
Yeah.
it's very unique to a number of different composers. Brahms apparently in his Requiem he swore off the metronome forever. He had also some bad experiences, and so you don't see one of the piano concertos, there's like one of the movements has a metronome marking, but by and large, some of these composers felt like, if you can't feel it in here, metronome marking isn't going to do any good anyway. And other composers every movement is metronomized, and it doesn't seem to really have a lot to do with when the piece was written. I mean, I kind of now watch, with a symphony when I'm playing stuff, and we're playing stuff in the 19th, 20th century. Metronome was very standardized, very functional. Certainly these composers had one sitting on their piano, and yet there aren't metronome markings often in the parts. So definitely was not a done deal. A lot of them felt like maybe it was a good reference tool. Maybe they used it in their teaching. Schumann used it very early on. We don't really know why, but it was truly hit or miss. So yeah.
Yeah, I was remembering when you were talking about that, I was remembering something that I read in this book about Barenboim. It's just a kind of like an interview kind of question answer thing, and somebody's asking him about I think Schumann, blah blah blah, for timing. And then Barenboim says, "Why is so much metronome data by composers too rapid? Because the composer does not physically hear the piece. When they write it, they only hear it in their heads. The weight of the sound isn't present." And that made a lot of sense to me. But wouldn't that kind of imply that maybe they would say, okay, what tempo marking should I put in here? And then they put it on while they're hearing it in their head rather than when they're playing it.
Yeah, well, we don't really know. I mean, generally, in most cases, I realized that the composers would even the composers that would metronomize a piece, that didn't come into it until the point where it was being published. So whether they were sitting down at the piano, whether they were hearing, a group play it, we really don't know. Whether it was done by an editor. I opened the book with an example of a publisher who was trying to publish all of Beethoven's music after his death. And basically hired a number of people who were very familiar with Beethoven's music to ascribe metronome markings to all the pieces that Beethoven had not put any on. So it's, and I give a number of stories in the book also, that it's even, when a composer puts the metronome marking in there, it's there are lots of problems. Yeah, lots of problems. I close with a very interesting story by Britain. I can actually, if I can pull it up here very quickly, I can read it to you because it was it's a charming story.
Benjamin Britten.
Yeah, hang on one second. So I'll just read you from the book. It's easier, I guess. And then there is the matter of live performance, another imponderable that can and often does alter a conception previously only imagined. Note the following exchange, which reportedly unfolded in rehearsal between composer Benjamin Britten and conductor Norman Del Mar. "Norman, it's too fast." "No, it's not, Ben. You wrote a metronome mark of 160, and that's exactly what we're doing." "But it's too fast." "No, Ben, we're playing exactly 160. I just checked it with my metronome." "Norman, what I'm trying to say is that when I wrote 160, I was wrong." "No, Ben, you were perfectly right." Yeah. So, yeah, it's never over.
Story.
Never over.
Any other questions for Marc before we go to the panel? It's a wonderful book, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brenda.
I just had a question, what you thought about Jeremy Montague put forward the idea that the metronome was really developed in one sense because with the rise of Beethoven and other composers, as the composers were not always present at the performances, when composers were very local, and that then it wasn't really necessary that the composer could be there, even in spite of these nice exchanges like Britten and Del Mar. But you have the local composer would be present and could correct any sort of timing changes. And I didn't know, and I forgive me, I haven't read your book yet, so maybe you address this in the book. But
well, yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it grew out of musical timekeeping existed long before the pendulum, as we saw with some of these early images. But early on, the idea was to create some means of being able to replicate a composer's tempos, where I talk about Lully. Melzel, I'm not sure that he was thinking anything specifically like that. I mean, he knew that this was something, a number of people, he had read a number of manuals of other kind of engineers who were trying to, on this race of trying to create this some device that would be standardized and be, the problem was you needed something that was accurate, something that you could actually see what the time was, but also hear it. He understood that ultimately. Something that was portable, because this 4-foot piece of material was certainly not very convenient to take from room to room, much less across to a rehearsal someplace. And then there was the idea of the issue of cost. And I talk at one point about one of the early clockmakers, to get back to what Lee was mentioning, a very famous French clockmaker who created some amazing early, they were clock metronome combinations. But these were instruments that would have been far out of the reach of most musicians. They were really created for, in certain cases, royalty. So I think Melzel, when he was kind of set about, he saw an opportunity. He was very entrepreneurial. He created and invented these various devices that did these pretty amazing things. But he was also a musician, and he saw a need for some kind of standardization, whether it was for the composer or whether it was for the musician to be able to replicate that, or whether it was to be able to teach time and create a good sense of pulse. He doesn't talk about that in anything I came across. He saw dollar signs, and he knew there was a need, and he got it done. And he was very, very, he was a fantastic self-promoter. And the idea of sending freebies to very well-known composers to basically kind of get him in those hands who can then champion his work, that was, we see examples of that kind of thing, right, even today. And Beethoven then was very quickly won over by this device and decided then at that point to kind of go back and start putting metronome markings on as many of his works as he could. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think Melzel's, the impetus was really a combination of finances. He was an engineer, and he saw an opportunity, and he created this amazing device that there was another image I had here. This is one, that was basically a pocket chronometer. This slid into a box. It did not. You'd have to do some mathematics to get it to a time beyond a second, because it was too small. But it was kind of on the other end, a very compact, portable. Oh, you can't see that. I'm looking at it. You guys see what I'm talking about. Sorry. This.
Oh yeah.
Chronometer in a box. So, yeah.
Anyway. Very interesting. Mark, how about if we start our panel discussion on how we use the metronome with you? Why don't you give us a brief idea of how you like to use it and how you advise using it?
So I use it, as probably many of my colleagues do, very sparingly. I used it recently because we were playing a piece in the symphony. Won't say anything more about what was happening. But my colleague, who's looking at me right now from the other side of the screen, we had a discussion about what the information was presented on the piece on the page. And so I, at one point, went home and checked the tempo, because it did not seem to be even in the same ballpark as what the composer was asking for. So for me, I think growing up, I used it a lot. I can remember practicing Bach with the metronome on just to make sure that I had a good sense of pulse. Because I am of the belief that you've got to have a starting point, and even though you don't want to play like a clock, like a metronome, you have to be able to convey and feel the pulse yourself. And it's very easy to think that your musical time is good until you put the metronome on and you're sure that it's wrong. We've all had that example, right? And then you pick it up and you like want to drop it in the trash can. Must be broken. Yeah, it was largely kind of a training device. It was certainly not something that my teachers, hamstringed me for. And once I was in college, it never even came up, I think, in a lesson. And now I will occasionally use it to double check my rhythm. There are certain pieces where it's, slow movement of Beethoven's Fifth. You want to know that each of those variations is as accurate as possible. But largely it's a reference tool for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I fall on the exact opposite side of the spectrum than you, Mark, because I am a true lover of the metronome. I love to work with it. I feel like it clears my head. I feel like I hear better, I think better, I analyze better when I practice with the metronome. Of course, I don't want to play metronomically either. But one thing that I tell my students, which I truly believe, is that when you learn to listen to a metronome when you're playing so that you can keep track of this clicking that's going outside of yourself, you are training yourself to be able to be aware of what's happening when you're playing that is not you. And that it's a way of learning how to listen outside yourself and make sure that you're actually keeping track, which is a challenge. We all
and it's great that there's the other side of the camp, of those who, I didn't write the book because I'm like want to put a metronome on my t-shirt, right? It's wrote it because I thought it was an interesting story, and it's a history that some musicians would be interested in knowing about.
And it's such a valuable tool.
There are, and just like you and I may have different versions or varying ideas about its use, this is a fraction of what it's been over the centuries of how people have addressed it. Yeah.
Well, who can we get to talk next? Liz, would you like to say how you use a metronome and how you would recommend your students to use it?
Sure. First of all, Mark, congratulations on this amazing achievement. Like all your writing, book is so well written and really admirable in terms of the amount of research and thought that went into it. I found it very readable. So congratulations to you. I just saw Mark the other day at orchestra, and I said, I'm not sure what to say about the metronome use. But then, as he was talking and going through this, which I heard a couple months ago in Quail Ridge as well, it started to occur to me, well, wait a second, I use it then, I use it there, and I use it. So I do, in my own personal practice, I guess I'm a little bit like Mark. I use it more for reference than anything else. But I do tend to use the metronome just when I'm warming up with scales. I like to have a metronome to make me practice slowly in the beginning, to really, especially I like to hear the subdivision and play long tones. That seems to me to be a really wonderful way to warm up. And it's also, I find it very relaxing. And so that is one thing I do teach my students as well, is whether it's open string practice, to just learn how to, engage your musculature, your skeleton, and your breathing to playing well in the beginning. I really think it's important before you do anything else in your day to do those things, especially if you are shorter and don't have long arms, as I am shorter and don't have long arms. And so you have to learn how to really use your body to play well. The metronome can be something that helps divide that bow up for you and makes it very clear what you need to do at the frog, as opposed to the tip, as opposed to your body and your breathing and your neck and your back and the whole thing. And so I find it a bit meditative at the beginning of my practicing, and my students have found that helpful. some other ways, just generally, the thing of just trying to get in your music, if you have a tough passage and you're trying to get it faster, click, 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 higher. But actually for me and my students, I recommend not just clicking up, but also every once in a while go back. So it's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back repeatedly, because then you are addressing other things in between. It's not just about the speed of the playing. You'll have, a moment to catch your breath and really work on other elements of that passage. Another interesting thing I was thinking about was metronome for vibrato practice. A lot of students, they just kind of randomly vibrate, and I guess I do too now. But a few years ago, many years ago, before I got my job in the orchestra, I worked with a teacher at one summer camp. He was the principal bassist of the Berlin Philharmonic. His name was Wolfgang Gudler, and I was playing a Brahms sextet. Which one is that? It goes da 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 da. Wrong key, I know, but and I was having trouble with that passage, and he said, "Well, you need to figure out a way to coordinate your vibrato with your bow speed." And I was like, what? That sounds really extreme and also very technical. And he said, yes, the way we teach it here is if you're playing something in a duple meter, you should basically practice your vibrato in triple meter. And if you're playing something in triple meter, you should vibrate in duple meter, because then there's a natural kind of flow to the music, and it won't sound too artificially circumscribed and divided evenly, And I do kind of think that way, although I try not to be compulsive about it. So when I'm working with students on vibrato, we will sometimes just, I have a student the other day working on the vocalese of Rachmaninoff, and his vibrato was so slow. And I just was like, there are some places you need to warm up that vibrato. Let's pick out certain notes. Let's turn on the metronome. Let's see if you can divide your vibrato in 3, So there are lots of creative ways I think you can use a metronome, but I don't always use it for every bit of my practice. So that's where I am.
Who would like to say something next? Lisa?
Okay. Well, first of all, Mark, like Liz, I enjoyed the book tremendously. Thank you very much for writing it. Lots of food for thought. And also I found it very interesting to have some voices about the metronome that I've heard here and there come in a new way in your book. And I guess one that fascinated me is, as I started to think about our meeting tonight, a number of years ago, I read an article by Gary Carr. I thought it was in Strings magazine. I tried to look for it, didn't seem to exist. And I had been fascinated because of the battle between good rhythm and freedom of expression that we can refer to in any number of ways, and one of them is the idea of the Y in the road, and you travel down it as you learn your instrument, and at some point you have to choose between perfection on the one hand and music making on the other. And that perhaps at the Y in the road, we leave the metronome behind. I don't know. I did know a pianist who said that she practiced in the green room till the last minute going on stage with the metronome. And I thought, she must be mad. But I don't know. However, the Gary Carr article spoke about his having studied those great musicians of the past whom he most venerated. One of them was Pablo Casals, whom he felt was such a fantastic interpretive artist and whose use of rubato is, legendary. And that he had analyzed recordings of a number of these artists. And his analysis had brought him to something very like the Matthews quote that you have in your book. And it kind of blew my mind. Gary Carr did not quote Matthews as you do, but here from the book I'm reading that when you have acquired rhythmical feeling so that you can play with the metronome without any particular hampering of freedom, then the next thing is to learn to feel the expression. And when it is well done, the metronome will come right with the playing when you take the whole 8 or 16 measures in succession. And Gary Carr had felt that these great artists all came back even to the metronome basically after 8 measures. And he had a special metronome made for him that would play such a slow beat that he could, in fact, work with that concept with himself and his students. That's what I remember. And I was fascinated to find that historic quote in here, and then Gary Carr is trying to measure it with his own measuring device and the great recordings. But I find that in my own work and my students, it's different. I use the metronome differently for myself than I do for them. I think I do tend to use it more when I'm preparing something orchestral than when I'm working on a solo piece. And it brings to me the idea that we're trying to be able to feel, to respond internally to an external stimulus, whether it's a conductor or a metronome, and to develop inwardly the ability to have something that can relate the two. So I have a little humorous diversion here. I can't get it. Yeah. Okay. So this is a Whitner tactile metronome that was sold on Shar for many years, and I got it for my daughter when she was tiny and learning the cello, and my students have always enjoyed that. But I use it for vibrato. I developed this way of I think using words with a beat can help us put it in the bow or in the left hand. So piece of vibrato where you have crust, 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 and then you might have peppers, peppers, and then finally you get to mozzarella, mozzarella, and when you get to 6s with the metronome set at 60, you can have extra crust, extra cheese, extra crust, extra cheese, and you have a nice controlled vibrato, and then you turn off the metronome and you can do anything. So that's a left-hand way that I use it, and I have an exercise called 818, and again, I think 60 is my favorite practice setting for doing things with students, where I would just have them learn to play with the bow near the bridge and do 8 beats on a down bow and then an up bow, then 7 beats and 6 beats all the way up to the fingerboard, 1 beat, and then work your way back down to 8 beats near the bridge, working with the control of weight, speed, and placement with the metronome. So those are 2 things that I have enjoyed doing with my students.
Oh, wonderful. Very interesting.
And you've made me very hungry in the process.
Sorry about that.
Know what I'm going to do when this Zoom is over. Have some pizza.
How about you, Tim? What do you think? What do you do?
I do a number of things. First of all, Mark, congratulations. Wonderful presentation. I look forward to getting and perusing your book eventually. Honestly, the first thought that comes to my mind is not so much what I do or what I don't do, but it is the memory of my mother, who is a piano teacher who is in her mid-80s and is still teaching students. And she has an electric Franz metronome. And if I'm talking one of those old style metronomes that must have been made back in the 1920s or 30s. And it just has this merciless sounding tick to it. I mean, there's no way you can ignore the sound of that metronome, no matter how fast or how slow it's ticking. And it only, I'll have to ask my mom the next time I talk with her by phone, but I don't think there's a volume control on it.
Does it have a light also? Is the box that has a red light also, like a strobe?
No, no red light. No light at all. Just torture, okay? but you know, I can remember. No, it's even older than that. I mean, it looks like, you know, it looks like the kind of metronome that you would put like in a 1934 Ford. You know, I mean, it's that old or looks that old. But when she would teach her students, occasionally she would have to turn that metronome on. And what I learned way back then is what I still practice and teach with my students now. There are two rules about the metronome, and we know them both. Rule number one, the metronome is always right. Rule number two, in case of disagreement, refer to rule number one. The metronome is always right. I think for my own practice, I am something of a renegade because I do a lot of listening. And there's something about my listening preferences and practices where I'm attracted to the sense of very steady rhythm. I mean, if I'm listening, say, to the Oscar Peterson Trio, I'm listening very closely to Ray Brown and Ed Thigpen as they communicate with each other. And even in North Carolina Central University, when I listen to the students in the jazz band, I often listen very carefully to the rhythm section. And even not just to the bass player and the drummer, but sometimes the pianist and the drummer. They're just locked in. And it's the kind of thing where if you turned on a metronome, the metronome would be unnecessary because they've already internalized and interactively made that a part of just what they do, no matter what the tempo is. It can be a slow blues, it can be so up tempo that you can't even think that fast. Well, I got to show you this. I don't know if you all have seen this. I just put 4 AAA batteries in it. It's one of those. It's now rather old, and I haven't used it in years because I thought it no longer worked. I just had bad batteries, so it's working again, and I'll definitely put it back to use. But of course, like we all, I use my metronome app. And just recently, for one of the pieces that I played on my recital, you know, just now 2 weekends ago, there is a section, actually it's an entire movement that's in 5/8. And the one thing we know about asymmetric meters is that when we go to phrase them, the asymmetry of the meter also contributes to the awkward, sometimes lopsided phrasing. And as we learn the music, or as I learn the music, I've learned to give myself a certain degree of levity or mercy, if you will, with regard to the metronome. But what I've also learned, honestly, the hard way, is how easy it is to rush when you're playing a 16th note passage in 5/8. And so what I literally had to do in the practice room, I set the metronome to 152 to the 8th note. And no matter what rhythm I had to play, I just kept it right at that tempo. And it felt too slow because the tempo of the movement is poco allegretto. I made the mistake of playing it allegro, and believe you me, I paid dearly when the passage work showed up. So the first thing I realized is that whatever tempo I thought allegro was too slow or too fast. Very much like the Benjamin Britten Norman Del Mar conversation. You know, it is okay to see a metronome marking, try it, and realize no matter what the composer was imagining, it needs to go slower. Because any music we play where the metronome marking is too fast, then some musicality is going to get sacrificed in the process. And that's unfair to us. It's unfair to our audience. So I think that in my own regular practice and teaching, I still use the metronome very simply. straight time, and again, listen to the metronome. And really, for us, the greatest challenge is regulating our muscular movement to the tick of the metronome. And then once the two become one, we're in good shape. Whether we're playing the third movement of Beethoven 8, heaven help us all, or an asymmetric passage, or even something that moves at lightning speed, where we have to back off of the metronome marking, slow it down, find out exactly what our fingers and the bow have to do, deal with all the string crossings, et cetera, et cetera. And once we get that, all of those intricacies coordinated, then we can gradually edge up the metronome marking to the tempo that's maybe a bit closer to what's marked. One other thing that I often will coach my ensembles, particularly in the NCCMI, is that when you're preparing for a performance, practice or rehearse at 3 different tempi. Pick a tempo where you just know that you're going to be dropping notes all over the place because it's too fast. And then go to the other extreme. Play slow, slow, that it feels too easy because you have more time than you need. And then at the performance, somewhere in the middle, I guess that's really what we mean when we say a happy medium, because you're not playing so fast you have no control, and you're not playing so slow that you have too much time. But if you can use the metronome to help you find out what's too fast and also what's way too slow, when the metronome is off and when you're in that moment of performance, you're not rushing because you're nervous. And more times than not, it actually takes more work to play too slow when there's an audience involved. You really have to be intentional about it. So somewhere in between those two extremes is that happy and practical and musical medium.
Thank you so much. That's great, Tim.
My pleasure.
How about you, Nancy?
Yeah, a few things just kind of random. I'll bounce around a little bit, but it comes to mind, when you talk about setting the metronome to, practicing at different tempi. And I found one thing that I try to counsel my students on is sometimes when the eventual tempo is actually quite fast, but they will be practicing at a slow tempo and then do it kind of martelet style, instead of already thinking ahead that you're not going to be able to do it martelet fast. It needs to be in the middle of the bow, détaché. And so kind of knowing that ahead of time. And then you set it on slow, but you don't try to make it sound really interesting in that slow tempo, but you're thinking ahead to where you want to be when you dial it up. A bit of a random comment, but some things, Tim, that you and Lisa said about students getting to be able to coordinate what they're hearing with the metronome with the physical motion. And I just recently started taking on some very young students, and it's really interesting how things that I kind of took for granted, mostly teaching older students, that, very simple. You put on a metronome, you're going to with a metronome. I totally taking it for granted, and then realizing for the really little kid, it's not that. Debbie, like what you said about having them have to multitask and that you're hearing something. It's like playing with a pianist for the first time. Do you actually have to coordinate what you're doing? Anyway, it's been very interesting. But I know you guys all know this, but I thought since nobody had mentioned it, I've gotten really into using the Dr. Beat. And one thing that it does so many things that I'll never use because it's so complicated. But I'm really sometimes, with students who are miscounting a lot and then kind of lose where they are in the bar. I found this function on it incredibly helpful. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. And then you can get her to 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. Anyway, I found it just incredibly helpful, because sometimes I use that because then it frees me up to sit with the student and actually play along with them. And then I hook her up to my computer speakers. And so it's really loud and both of us can hear it while we're working. And so I found that just incredibly helpful. And sometimes I just turn it on so you get the regular tick, but having the ability to do that, and of course you can set her on, all sorts of so we've decided to call her Cruella. But anyway, so yeah, I was thinking, and I thought I might just mention this about use of metronome in recording sessions because of splicing. And how I remember somebody who was, I think it was an Emerson quartet recording, and the person was an engineer or producer or something. It's saying they all went in there with metronomes, and I would do that too. So you're not doing a whole bunch of takes where you start changing tempo. And then when editing comes, it becomes this nightmare. And I recently did my most recent recording. I didn't bring a metronome, and I thought, let me just try, just winging it, just going with a few. I regretted it because we started to lag into tempi that weren't our, how we had rehearsed. And sure enough, I'm going back and listening at the takes now, and I'm thinking that was a mistake, but anyway, that's really useful, I think, for recording.
Well, that's very interesting, Nancy. And our time is practically nearly up, but I do want to open the floor to anyone else who would like to say something about how they use a metronome.
Nathaniel, you've been on the opposite end in the recording studio. Is this something that you've encountered, or has it been pretty innocuous?
Yeah, it can always be an issue. I think a lot of times it depends on, especially if it's not a solo act, if there's collaborators. Oftentimes, if decisions about tempo aren't made in advance, or for years playing together, for example, then it can start diverging a little bit, and there'll need to be a conversation about where we can meet somewhere in the middle or one or the other.
Yori, you turned on your video. I hope you want to say something.
I do. I can relate to everything that everyone has said, and in grad school years, I actually found a setting on Dr. Beat where I could beat it once every 8 bars, and I tried it on the Franck sonata. The first movement was just perfect to do 8 bars. And also in grad school, I've learned to use the metronome on the offbeats. I got my pianist into that too. And Nathaniel knows her, Liz DeMio. I was practicing so much, and even with the pianist, that I couldn't get the metronome back on the beat. Like I could put it on any 16th note or any triplet, but it just felt dull to put it on a beat.
That's very interesting.
And currently, I'm actually not really using a metronome, but I sequence everything into Sibelius, so I have a guide track. I feel like the longer I play, the less I can trust my ear or any part of my body to do anything musically. So, and since I play so much repertoire that's not even recorded, I need to have some kind of guide track.
Interesting. Mark, were you going to say something?
No, what Yuri was talking about with the offbeat, because that's what makes most pop music and rock so interesting and kind of energizes that stressing the offbeat, which is just not part of the traditionally the Western canon so much. Yeah.
Oh, Lisa.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that it's crossed my mind that for kids, the process of getting the beat internalized may be more difficult these days, with the absence perhaps as much of swinging on a swing and jumping rope. And so just wanted to put that out there. But I think that for us as teachers working with younger people or adults who don't seem to have it, that large physical rhythmic motions to something heard or seen, that kind of big coordination can help finally put it into the bow and the left hand better perhaps than just sitting everybody down and trying to play with the metronome.
Yeah, Lisa, I just was teaching somebody yesterday who gave no indication of feeling the rhythm in their body at all. It was actually alarming. And so we just stood up and marched in place and tried to get her to swing her arms and stamp. And at first it was just just no sense of rhythm. And then she started to lock into it. So, you know, what you say, and I thought, oh, it is there after all, you know. So yeah, totally makes sense. The whole body, feeling it in the body.
Brenda? Oh, sorry.
Okay, I was just going to throw in one more thing. A lot of years ago, I watched Rhonda Cole, the great violin pedagogue, and she had all of her students use the William Starrer rhythm books. And if you're interested, they're still available, where you see the notated beat with its measure and then a rhythm that you're supposed to learn to say. And she would use the Kodai rhythm words, and she would have them learn to conduct. Even tiny kids, they were learning to conduct in duple and triple meter while saying the rhythm. And that was another way of putting it in the body that I thought was very interesting.
And maybe the last, Brenda, before we say goodnight.
Oh, just something really quick. I've been known to use a metronome even in my martial arts with the forms. And I actually do some instructing in martial arts now. And I find it really helpful to get the timing of the forms. Anyway, just very quick.
Wonderful. Well,
my wife just sent me an off-camera cartoon. I don't know if you can see it. A little bit of off-camera humor, courtesy of my wife, Leslie.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well,
I
Debbie,
also
thank you
have
very
a piece.
for hosting and for doing such a great job advertising for this. I'm not sure the great metronome event that Marc Moskovitz great metronome event that Marc Moskovitz and great have ever appeared in the same sentence before. So I'll run with that one. So, but thank you all for being here. Super interesting, and yeah, happy practicing.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Debbie.
Mark,
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Be safe, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.